ever understand this complex genius, this visionary thinker? Will we ever get this close again, uniting the forces of our universe?
Hey everyone, and welcome to Age of Reason. Today, episode 40. It's like the middle of February 2019. Pretty cold outside, pretty good inside. Before we start, I just want to promote my book once again, Beyond the Obscure. Please get it. It's a very good book. Psychological horror, but don't be put off by that label, because if people who really know me, they know me that, well, I'm an atheist and I like science. I like to explain things that are realistically possible. So there's a lot of things in this book that you will like, just outside the horror thing. So please do get it. It's available on Amazon. The links will be available in the description. Please check out my art as well on Redbubble. It's mainly a bunch of posters, but it's really for all kinds of taste. There's some mature content as well. So anyway, please check it out. People like posters in general. I sure do. I have things all over the place. So it's always good, and I try to make new things all the time. Today I'm going to talk about climate change. This is not a continuation of last week at all, but it is all related, of course, so it does help if you've watched the previous shows. So today's article comes from Scientific American, and the title is Climate Forecast: World is Sleepwalking into Catastrophe. And it was posted mid-January 2019. This came up recently in the comments on my page because, yeah, it seems to me also that people are just extremely indifferent when it comes to the topic of climate change. If you watched the movie Before the Flood with DiCaprio, even he says at the beginning, I think, that every time you even start talking about climate change, people just kind of tune out. It's just not interesting. But actually, climate science is extremely interesting. There's a lot of stuff that goes into it. It's not just weather science. It's it's climatology in general. It's watching the oceans, because they play a huge part, of course, as well. It's watching the forests, because there's a lot of deforestation going on right now. It's about desertification. If you live in Africa, there's a high risk that the deserts are moving in because of erosion and stuff like that. So yeah, it's a really huge field. There's a lot of sciences involved. It's not just one thing. So, and yeah, it's the same with me. I often talk about it. I often post about it on my own page, but I just don't really get much response. And yet, I understand, of course, it's not as important as your Instagram posts and your pictures of food. I totally understand that. All right, so this is a picture from the Philippines. It's from a place, Kalumpit. I hope I pronounced it correct. Usually you pronounce every letter in some languages as they are. And this is a picture after a flood from a typhoon. So, of course, I live in Japan. We get a lot of typhoons as well, but of course Japan is what we call a developed nation. So every time there's a typhoon here, or even an earthquake, except of course that big one that happened in Fukushima, usually the damage, well, it depends what you're talking about, because the material damage may be quite high, but not many people lose their lives, and that's usually the big difference between a developed nation and a developing nation. Some countries like the Philippines, for example, are at very high risk. And you can see in the picture, this is, by the way, a very typical picture of construction in that country. Of course, if you go to Manila, you get some actual buildings there. But once you head outside, even to the island of Cebu, or Mindanao province, you see a lot of these kind of buildings, not very sturdy at all, and just, if there's a flood, then all of that can easily be gone. So, and this is happening. This is the thing. This is happening right now. So if you're sitting somewhere in the middle of the States and, floods don't affect you and perhaps the drought doesn't really affect you, you might have the illusion that everything is okay. Everything is fine because in my backyard is okay. And unfortunately, this type of thinking, this type of small world thinking, that in my place everything is okay, so therefore everywhere must be okay, that's a very kind of a cancerous idea, actually, and it spreads quickly. That spreads very quickly, indeed. So climate change is the biggest threat to the planet, the World Economic Forum said yesterday in a sweeping catalog of global risks. The institution's annual analysis of economic dangers worldwide named extreme weather, natural disasters, man-made environment disasters, biodiversity loss, and failure to adapt to climate change as the chief perils to society. And since we're on that topic, I just wanted to mention that, some people say, well, the climate has always been changing. Yeah, but that means, usually that type of sentence is uttered by people who actually don't understand climate change at all. Or they might say that as a joke, but if they are serious, and usually if I check on those people, it turns out that they are serious about it. So if you are actually saying that just climate has always been changing, so that's, nothing to worry about, well, you just haven't studied the topic then. And you should probably take a course or two online and study from universities or something like that, because the rate of change is absolutely out of control just very recently, in a very short time span. We're talking about 150 years, or even since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. That's what you're talking about. You're comparing that tiny slice of time to basically, I don't know how long these cycles are, but they are very, very long. They, I think, millions of years. So you're comparing apples and oranges. It's not the same thing. Of all the risks to the globe, it is in relation to the environment that the world is most clearly sleepwalking into catastrophe, the WEF said in its Global Risk Report. The results of climate inaction are becoming increasingly clear. So again, I showed this curve last time, but this is important. Perhaps it is the most important thing here to remember. The curve of CO2 emissions goes hand in hand with the amount of population. So the more people you have, the more consumption you have, and then, of course, CO2 emissions increase as well. They really go hand in hand. And people were saying, I've read some interesting things, actually. I heard people say that, well, if you're talking about this problem of overpopulation, then we're going back to the days of what was called eugenics. Okay, but eugenics was a term coined towards the end of the 19th century or so. If you're looking at the curve, the population at that time was still manageable. So again, it's not a fair comparison. It sounds intellectual, but yet it fails miserably. The population rises dramatically after World War II, and that's already, we're in uncharted waters now. This is new territory. We don't really know how this is going to end up. Don't act surprised. This happens all the time. Before the economic crisis in the US, for example, very few professional economists actually thought that the economy would collapse the way that it did. Very few of them. And they're supposed to be professionals. They're supposed to be the experts on the matter. And yet they got it wrong. So don't just listen to some people on the internet that don't really know what they're talking about. It's true, we don't know at all, actually, where this is going. But usually the results so far have always been worse than the prediction. Just bear that in mind. The report noted that the IPCC in October analysis that bluntly said we have at most 12 years to make the drastic and unprecedented changes needed to prevent average global temperatures from rising. 1.5 degrees Celsius, roughly 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. Limiting global temperatures increase to that amount is the goal of the International Paris Agreement. Meeting that goal will require unprecedented action to drive decarbonization of agriculture, energy, industry, and transport, WEF report said. However, it appears increasingly unlikely that the world will meet even the 2 degrees upper limit identified by the Paris Climate Agreement. Yes, unfortunately, that is the case. Even countries like China, who have done tremendous progress actually on solar panels and stuff like that, even they actually increased their coal production in the last year, I think. That was the statistic. So they built more. There were satellite pictures released of some sites that were unfinished, and then they were finished, fully built and ready for operation or already in operation. So yeah, I fear that until at least 2030, there is a very high chance that we're going to definitely keep increasing the emissions. Maybe then, after that, it will curb. We'll have to see. The world's leading climate scientists have warned that there is only a dozen years of global warming to be kept at the maximum of 1.5 degrees, beyond which even half a degree will significantly worsen the risk of droughts, floods, extreme heat, and poverty for hundreds of millions of people. So this is a related article, of course, and it's interesting because why is it so important, I should say, to keep it at 1.5 degrees and not 2 degrees? Well, here are some quick facts. For example, so by the end of the century, let's say, global sea level rise would be 10 centimeters lower, with global warming of 1.5 compared to 2. So you're probably thinking that, well, half a degree is not that big of a deal. Certainly for people, in Japan in summer, let's say it's 40 degrees Celsius. If it's 40.5, definitely will adapt to that. It still sucks. I hate summer, but we can definitely survive. But it does make a huge difference on the ice out there and on the crops out there. Extreme heat waves will be experienced by 14% of the world population at least once every 5 years at 1.5 degrees, but that figure rises to more than a third of the planet if the temperatures rise to 2 degrees. Again, huge difference. Just half a degree makes a huge difference. We're talking about global average temperatures. Again, it's not just your temperature in your one little spot on the Earth. We're talking about the average on the globe. So there are temperature sensors all over the planet, and that's how we measure it, very precisely indeed. Arctic sea ice would remain during most summers if warming is kept to 1.5, but at 2 degrees, ice-free summers are 10 times more likely, leading to greater habitat losses for polar bears, whales, seals, and seabirds. If warming is kept to 1.5 degrees, coral reefs will still decline by 70 to 90%. Again, that's what we're talking about, the best case scenario. We still have to lose 70 to 90% of coral reefs. It's absolutely ridiculous. But if temperatures rise to 2 degrees, virtually all of the world's reefs would be lost. Again, it seems quite insignificant, only half degree, and yet it has huge, huge implications. The coral reefs, they support entire communities. There are many Pacific Island nations, and they kind of rely on that because their fish comes from, the fish lives in that environment. So if the coral reefs are bleached completely or gone, then the fish either dies off as well or is forced to move to some other habitat, and then the people on that island cannot survive. It's all related. It's all a chain. Once you start breaking the chain, it collapses entirely. Which I'm going to talk about in a future article, because it's important to understand that collapse is already happening right now. Collapse is a process. It's not a result of something. It's a process, and we are absolutely in that process. The Trump administration's fourth national climate assessment in November, meanwhile, said that without significant reductions in emissions, average global temperatures could rise 9 degrees Fahrenheit by the turn of the century. So this is Trump's own group. These are people, I mean, come on, a lot of people in his cabinet are absolutely paid by the fossil fuel industry. They deny climate change. They misinform the people on purpose because they're paid to do that. But even his own climate panel says that if we don't change anything, then we're in for a drastic increase in temperature. The risk report pointed to the accelerating pace of biodiversity loss, which I also have another article on. See, I'm well prepared. I do my research very well, so I have a lot of time to do that. And I was talking about that before. The system that we live in does not favor knowledge. Governments don't want, smart, intellectual people. They want people who, like George Carlin was saying at the time, they want people who just, are smart enough to operate the machines, to push the buttons, but they're not smart enough to actually cause some drastic change. Governments fear intellectual people. They're a direct danger to them. I have the time to do my research because I don't have a full-time job. Well, there's various reasons for that. Health issues being a major issue. There's others, but instead of just, kind of, I should say, enjoying my life and maybe going out with, hanging out with friends or, playing video games, which I like to do, I spend a lot of time studying. There is no excuse these days. A lot of resources are free. So you just need the time to do it. Sit down and study. That's all. It's fun anyway. You learn new things. That should be fun. But people call me a nerd. Are you a nerd? So you see, this is exactly what the problem I'm talking about. So now intellectual is bad. It's not in fashion. So people like me now are very kind of isolated from society. I can't find many friends out there. It's very difficult because they also have this mentality. Also, you're a nerd, so I can't have fun with you, whatever that means. All right, so biodiversity loss, particular concern. Species abundance is down 60% since 1970. I mentioned that on the previous show. That affects the human food chain, health and socioeconomic development, with implications for well-being, productivity, and even regional security. So again, I said that before. When I was in high school, my geography teacher in the human geography class was talking about food wars. He was talking about water wars, and even at the time, that was in the 90s, I was saying, like, come on, there's no way. I mean, it's just a fear campaign. It's just propaganda, or it's something very unknown. And yet we see these things happening already. We see that happening, well, at least for a decade now, probably more. So these things are happening. Climate change as well is increasing strain on the global food system through changes in temperature, precipitation, and extreme weather events, along with higher carbon emissions. The last 4 years have been the hottest on record, it said. Sea level rise is another peril. An estimated 800 million people in more than 570 coastal cities are vulnerable to oceans rising 1.6 feet by 2050. And a lot of these cities are in the States as well. So, these people should absolutely be worried. Higher waters are already hitting home in the United States, the report said. Cities like Norfolk, Baltimore, Charleston, and Miami experience flooding on sunny days due to rising sea levels. Rising water threatens roads, railways, ports, sanitation systems, tourism, agriculture, power plants, and underground cables that connect the internet. Well, yeah, if you're, again, if you're in Miami, since they mention it here, you could be enjoying your day out in your lawn, and then sewage water comes from below. because the water is rising, right? This is already happening. We already see that. Many people complain about it. And yet the governor of Florida, who is Rick Scott, if I'm not mistaken, he's a climate change denier. He takes huge donations from fossil fuel industries. So that's your enemy. I'm not your enemy. Please try to understand that. I'm just trying to spread knowledge to people, information, because a lot of the time what I talk about is very neglected on mass media. It's maybe like somewhere in the corner or a footnote on CNN or BBC or something, but I give these issues, I shed light on those issues, which is very important. The article ends by, as sea levels rise and urban vulnerabilities increase, the urgency of the need to respond to these changes is going to intensify, the report said. Beyond adaptation measures, addressing urban vulnerability to sea level rise will require households, businesses, and governments to avoid exacerbating dangers. There is little point putting new flood defenses in place, for example, if existing defenses are undermined through continued development of homes and businesses in coastal areas and on floodplains. So the first time I heard about floodplains was also back in my geography class in high school. And basically the teacher said, all right, so floodplains, that's what it means. It's a plain that gets flooded occasionally from time to time. People build houses there. What do you think is going to happen? Of course, it's going to get flooded. So my question was, well, why do people build there then? Isn't that just dumb? And the reason, of course, is cost. Of course, if you buy land there, it's much cheaper. And some people don't even study the area. They think it's a great price. So I'm gonna, build a house there. And then it gets flooded. But that is a problem also of population. So these people probably have nowhere else to go. The number of apartments is limited wherever you go in New York, Tokyo, Berlin. So then the rest of the people, they have to live somewhere. So then they go to these places, but then these places get flooded, or there's severe droughts there or whatever. So anyway, it all kind of comes back in full circle, I guess. Okay, and that's it for today's show. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you found it interesting. The whole idea is to find some educational value in this and hopefully learn something. And, if you like it, please share it. Please remember to get my book, Beyond the Obscure, available on Amazon. Please check out my art on Redbubble as well. All the links will be in the description below. And hopefully I will see you next week. Probably we'll talk more about something related to climate change. Until then.